this show. I believe we got some footage if Tony can run it over there, or a picture rather. You co-hosted the show, I believe you
Yeah,
said,
I did
for
18.
18 years?
Wait a minute, 14 years. That's
14
correct.
years.
14 years.
And I guess that was, something in
See,
itself.
John Forney, the first
Right.
guy that did it was Maury Farrell.
Right.
And then Maury Farrell, for whatever reason, wasn't doing it, and John Forney started doing the show, and had done it with him for several years. And at that time, John and a guy named Bob Lucky had the Lucky Forney Advertising
Right.
Agency. Well, the sponsor of the show were Coca-Cola and Golden Flake, and just so happened that neither Coke and Golden Flake were associated with Lucky Forney Advertising. So Bob Lucky finally said, "Hey, John," said, "you got to decide whether or not you're in the advertising business or you're going to be a TV personality."
There we've got a.
Because
Is that
yeah.
young? Them two young fellas
oh,
there.
look, that young guy, yeah. But anyway, so John, given that, he had to give up the show, and Frank Taylor was at Frank Taylor Advertising, was doing the show at that time, and I remember he called me and wanted to have lunch with me one day, and I didn't know about all this change going to be made, and he came down, and we met at what used to be Joe Namath's old restaurant down there, and we sat down, and he started talking. He said, said, "I've talked to Coach Bryant, and he's agreed, said, we want you to do his television show with him." And I said, "Wait a minute now, what about John?" And he went on to explain that John had to give up the show because of the advertising situation. So I did, and of course you can imagine how nervous you would be on the first time you sat down. Though I never was, after I got over the initial fright around Coach Bryant, and people worked for him, you weren't scared of him because he was, he could be the most compassionate person in the world. He could also be pretty volatile at times. And but speaking of TV shows, and I also used to go up every Tuesday morning during the football season. It was on Tom York's morning show.
Right.
And this one particular Tuesday morning, it was kind of late in the year, and it was time for people to start thinking about who was going to be All-American, who the All-American candidates were, and all-conference candidates. And Tom asked me that on the show. So I kind of threw out a few names, and I drove on back to that show. I was on like at 7 o'clock in the morning.
Right.
I drove on back to Tuscaloosa, never dreaming that Coach Bryant would watch a Birmingham TV show at 7 o'clock in the morning. I got back, and there was a note on my door, said, "See Coach Bryant immediately." So I went downstairs, Coach Bryant's office, and knocked. And he said, "Come in." I came in. I sat down, and I realized right then he didn't call me down there to tell me what a good job I was doing. So I sat down there. He sat there and wrote, seemed like forever, and kept me waiting, which was one of his old ploys, and it was just pretty good. I've learned to do that too when I was an athletic director. But anyway, he finally looked up at me and he said, said, "I don't contribute but one thing around here, and that's getting players ready to play on Saturday." He said, "I sure as hell can't do it with you up there popping off how great they are." So I said, "Yes, sir." Well, the next week we were playing at Clemson, and I was over there in the town of Spartanburg, South Carolina, had a TV station. I was on it, and the sports guy said, "Well, who are y'all's All-American candidates this year?" I said, "I don't know. Coach Bryant hadn't told me yet." So I learned my lesson on that real quick.
But talking about All-Americans, and you mentioned this name a while ago, we'll, quickly hit on some of these players. Joe Namath. What would stand out about Joe?
Well, I came there Joe's senior year, and it wasn't like I was there like when I was with Stabler and some of the others
Right.
the whole 4 years. And so, while I certainly know Joe pretty well, I wasn't enough of a football expert to realize how great a player Joe was. I heard the coaches talk about him and other teams, but when he was, he was something special. But that was a year, he'd gotten into trouble
Right.
the year before and that type thing. But Joe was always really good to work for. We went to Orange Bowl that year, and that was the year that Sonny Werblin, signed him the huge contract. Yes, and Mr. Werblin came up during the game in the press box and wanted me to make sure that gave me his phone number where he wanted Namath to call him at that time, which I did. And ironically, the next year we also went back to the Orange Bowl and had a quarterback named Steve Sloan who did a pretty good job.
Had a pretty good game that night, didn't he?
It sure did. And I got a phone call during the middle of the game, and somebody said, "It's Sonny Werblin calling you." And I thought, well, somebody's kidding me, So I went and asked one, and sure enough, it was Sonny, and he wanted me to let Steve Sloan. He said, "Would you tell Steve Sloan not to sign anything with anybody till I have a chance to talk to him?" And I thought that was rather unusual, but of course that didn't work out that way. Steve, I think, went with Atlanta.
I believe, for a little while.
Something like that. But Joe was a great athlete, and he could do anything. And I remember I played golf with him a time or two, and he could knock the ball out of sight, just a natural athlete. I never saw him play basketball, but they say in pickup games, he could dunk it for anybody around Alabama could dunk a basketball. Okay. He just was such a gifted athlete.
What about Kenny Stabler?
Well, Snake was unusual. You can say that. He was a free spirit, but he was a tremendous athlete and one of the great all-time left-handed passers, and he won a lot of ball games with Kenny Stabler. He always managed to stay in Coach Bryant's doghouse, but he was Kenny is a good person. He just he liked the nightlife a little bit.
Well, one thing that happened while you were down that way was Coach Bryant and the record. What was it like leading up? And is that, because I know the pressure, and I've read where he said that he felt the pressure more because he felt like that he owed it as the leader to get the record for the players.
Right. Well, let me go back before I talk about that a little bit.
Okay.
There's something that came before that time, and that was the slowdown in the Alabama program in the late 60s and going into the 70s, because there were a lot of people who thought Coach Bryant was spending too much time on outside things, businesses he had, and going to he'd go out to California, to Palm Desert with the McKays, and taking the time away, and there were a lot of people, that really felt like maybe he should retire, and there was a lot of criticism of Coach Bryant about the time. And I'll never forget, he called me in one day and said that we were going to change the offense. We were going to the Wishbone, and that he had Darrell Royal and Emory Ballard were coming up, and we'll be out to Holiday Inn and be with our offensive coaches and Mal Moore and so forth, and wanted me to come out there and see what they were talking about, but no way possible to leak it. Okay, so I went out. Of course, I didn't know a Wishbone whatever, and but they did that and did it in secrecy, put it in that fall, and when the Skyriders came around, that back then they used to have the Skyriders went around to all the campuses, and what they basically did was that they ran the old formations. I mean, they just lined up what we'd been running, ran it, and then the Skyriders didn't know any difference. And some of the writers that cover us on a daily basis knew we were doing something different, but we kind of got their attention, and they didn't say anything about it. We go out to open the season with Southern Cal, and I can't remember the Southern Cal's announcer's name, but he was a great guy, did a heck of a job out there. But before the game, he and John Forney and Doug Layton got together up in the booth, and I was up there with them. And they'd beaten us 42-21 or something like that the year before. Birmingham just annihilated us. And he was talking about, well, you're the same formation, blah, 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 blah. And John Forney was saying, yes, we're doing the same thing we did last year, Well, we had called, Coach had asked me to call Doug and John Forney and bring them down, and they came down in strictest secrecy. We showed them a film of the Wishbone, which was a film that Emory Ballard had developed, and it's showing how it operated and everything. So they knew about it going in, but so, in other words, they crossed their fingers and said, yeah, we're doing the same thing we did last year. And we got the ball in the first series. We started running the Wishbone, and the two announcers' booths were right next to each other, and the guy from Southern Cal was knocking on the booth at John Forney. He was really mad at him, and Johnson, like that. But that's